Getting things done is a challenge that everyone struggles with. One way to tackle it is to make sure that you have the right tools, and for your computer, that means the right apps. The problem is, not all apps do what they promise, and the drawn-out search for the right solution makes it harder to get the job done. That's why there's SetApp. SetApp is on a mission to help users get more done. With SetApp, there's no more worrying about having to search for apps to solve a problem. Instead, SetApp packs over 200 apps for your Mac and iPhone into one. There's an app for any task, so you can stay in your flow and finish what you started. With SetApp, you can think about your tasks, not your apps. A dedicated curation team only selects the highest quality apps, and new apps are added to SetApp regularly. Updates are free, and all the apps are full-featured pro versions. It's also a great value. Instead of paying thousands of dollars for separate licenses, there's just one flat monthly fee. Head over to setapp.com to try SetApp for a week. If you like SetApp, pay just $9.99 a month, as long as it's useful to you. And trust us, it will be. That's setapp.com, setapp.com. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Nick Walton. He's the co-founder and CEO of Latitude. And they started out with a thing called AI Dungeon, and I want to hear about the beginnings of it all. How are you, sir?
Good. Great to be here.
Thanks for hanging out. When did AI Dungeon start? Because I don't remember the exact date, but when it happened, it was a splash.
Yeah, so it started really at a hackathon in mid-2019. So my family had recently started playing D&D, and one of the things I loved about it was this ability to solve problems in creative and flexible ways, right? Like it wasn't like games where you only have three options. You could really think of anything, and that ended up with these amazing, funny stories where you did this crazy thing and were able to solve the problem. So I was at that hackathon, and I was playing around with this new natural language generation system that had just come out called GPT-2. And playing around with it, I realized like, hey, you can do this kind of dynamic storytelling in an interesting way and make something similar to that experience in D&D where you're not selecting from a few options, but you can express in natural language what you're going to do. So I built that first version of AI Dungeon, and over the next couple months, I got that version out on the internet. This was before it blew up. So this was sometimes called AI Dungeon 1 or Classic. It was with a much smaller AI model. And it was fun. There were maybe a couple thousand people played it. And like it was very funny in its absurdity. So it wasn't at the point where it was like coherent on, paragraph page level. And so it would just have like crazy things. And it was kind of fun for that reason. It wasn't until the larger language models, so like the full size of GPT-2 and Control and some of these other language models came out, that like it got to this level of coherence that I would say it got to the first point where it was really compelling. So at that point, I had worked on it over, the next 8 months. I think I was in my last semester of my bachelor's, and I ended up like spending 25 hours a week on it and like getting straight C's that semester, which is exactly what I targeted. I was like, what could I do and graduate, but be able to spend as much time as I can on AI Dungeon? And not because I thought it would be a company or a big thing, but honestly, just because I was kind of obsessed. Like I just thought it was so fun. And so I was pretty focused on it. So then I released it as a collab notebook with this larger version. And that's when it just kind of exploded. So I think it was something like 100,000 people played it in the first week, which really blew my mind. It, ended up in a bunch of news articles, spread on Twitter. And that's when I realized like, hey, there's something really interesting here where people are having this experience they've never had before. And this freedom to, for example, like meet a dragon in the forest, and instead of having to fight it, you can offer it a freshly baked cupcake and then bond with it over your love of pastries and like open a bakery shop with the dragon and then write a best-selling book, right? Like all these stories that would never be possible in a normal game suddenly become opened up. And there's something cool too about how every single story is unique And so people would play it and then be like, oh, yeah, I went and did this and did that. But I'm sure everyone does that. And I'm like, no, literally, I have never heard of anyone doing anything like that before. Like every game playthrough is unique and different. And there's something fun and I think inherently viral about that. So that's part of why it spread and blew up.
My partner is not a gamer, but she, when we play a game, I'll be using the joystick, and then she'll say, "Oh, well, you should go and talk to that guy." And I'm like, "Well, no, that's an NPC. Like he only sells stuff. No, but he might know what's going around. He might know where the bad guys are." And like, well, no. And then I realized that this game, like Skyrim, for example, or any of those kind of games, is on rails. When
Yeah.
we, as people who play games, think about a game that's on rails, we think of games like dungeon, Dragon's Lair, where you literally are on a rail. You're like on rails, and you can go left or right, and that's it. And then open world games like, Grand Theft Auto or whatever, like you can do anything. You can't do anything. You can't do anything at all. There's no freshly baked cupcakes at all. There is a text tree of say these four things, and if you want to be mean or not mean or extra, like extra kind, not win the game without punching anybody, that just isn't a thing. All games are on rails. You're effectively removing the rails.
Yeah, that's the goal, and that's what we're really excited about is allowing. Our mission as a company is really unlocking the creativity of people with AI, whether that's from the player perspective, where you can be creative in how you experience it and make stories, and then also on the creator perspective, because even for as on rails Skyrim is, it's also more open than all the other games that are even more on rails.
Yeah,
And to make that kind of open experience takes so much work from hundreds of people, 5 years, $100 million, because you have to handcraft every single part of this whole world. And our vision long term is we transform it so rather than needing a 100-person team to see your creative vision come to life, you can just work with an AI, kind of like, what's Iron Man's Jarvis? Kind of like Jarvis.
Yeah.
Like you just say, like, Jarvis, okay, I want to build this massive world that has all these cool elements and these characters are fighting and there's this epic story. And the AI's like, great. And goes and fills in all the detail like a whole team might. So that's kind of the long-term vision that we're really excited about.
Interesting. So Jarvis, in this case, Latitude, and the engine behind AI Dungeon and the Latitude engines would be a team member, effectively, that you would collaborate with to help accelerate your vision with fewer people. And your point about how many people worked on Skyrim is it's a huge number of people to make it that open.
Yeah.
You want to make it easier for anyone to be able to do that kind of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you see, with Minecraft and now with Roblox, like there's a lot of power when people have the tools to create interesting things and kind of express their creativity. And so we definitely don't see AIs like replacing, the creative things that humans do and only humans can do, but rather amplifying it and allowing them to do much more than they could by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Let's dig a little bit into the tech, because I'd like to understand from a place of ignorance where I'm coming from, is I have a general sense of how models work. And I understand that large language models are somewhat unique. And there was a kind of an acceleration from Microsoft's Turing NLG in February 2020, which is now GPT-3, which is 10 times larger. Large language models got big, and they represent big corpuses of knowledge. But are you using like anything that any human on the planet Earth can do? Or how are you constraining what you can do? Like might want to play an adventure game with dragons. You don't necessarily want spaceships to show up.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll answer the first question on language models and then move to kind of the constraints question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Large language models have been advancing at a crazy pace. So over the last 2 to 3 years, they've been increasing in size by 10x every 6 months. So like this is like Moore's law, but like supercharged on steroids, like insanely fast. I don't think that trend will, like, it'll obviously peter out at some point, but
Mm-hmm.
I think probably still a couple more years we're going to have larger and larger language models. At a high level summary for people who don't know how they work, I think the best way to think of these large language models is they're really like the text predictor on your phone, but made 1,000 or 10,000 times smarter. So rather than just being able to predict, like, yeah, maybe you might use this word, it's smart enough by saying predict this word and the next word and the one after that, like it can write a compelling story just through that process. So it's pretty cool what happens when you scale up these language models to large sizes, because there's just this capacity to do interesting things. that's just not possible with smaller ones. And so that's one thing that's really cool to see. In terms of constraints, I think the answer is it's it's not a solved problem yet how you have the right constraints in a world, because with traditional game development, you really start from you can do nothing and you have to slowly add in what you can do. Whereas we have the reverse problem. You start with you can do everything and we have to like put in the right constraints on the AI of like what you can and can't do. So I would say in terms of building in those constraints, like the spaceship example, like, one thing you can do in AI Dungeon right now that you can't do in a normal game is just make up like, oh, I pulled out my flamethrower. And it's like, there's nothing in the story about you having it, but you just decided you have it and it's there. So I think the best way to describe the current AI Dungeon is it's very much like Minecraft creative mode. So we're not at the point where there's necessarily the constraints and challenge that you have in other games. It's more of like, yeah, you've kind of free reign, but it's what are you going to create and how are you going to make the story unfold? Figure out how to make those more structured versions and constraints are a lot of the work we've been doing behind the scenes over the last year since AI Dungeon came out.
Mm-hmm. I really like that analogy of starting with nothing. Like, hey, let's make a game. Let's go to Game Maker. Let's go to Unity. You have nothing. Good luck. Versus what you're doing, which is kind of like Michelangelo. It's like I found a piece of marble. I'm pretty sure David's in there somewhere. I just need to remove all the pieces that aren't David.
Yeah.
And then I'll have my thing. The model, the large language model, can you explain the role between that? Like it's and I'm being overly simplistic with no disrespect, it's a chatbot. I can just start talking to GPT, 1, 2, 3, and get different relationships. But what you're doing is quest completion detection and model output, and you have a concept of world memory. Can you explain the relationship between a simple chatbot and the constraints and the work that you do on top of that corpus of data?
Yeah, so at the core, you have a language model that takes text in and spits text out, continuing off that previous text. So the very basic part of AI Dungeon is you start with a story, you type an action, we feed that story plus the action into the AI, and it writes the next part of the story. So that's like the very simple level. There are some issues with that. One is you have a limited amount of input that you can give to the model. It's on the order of 2,000 words. The challenge is if your story is more than 2,000 words, suddenly it's forgetting things, right? Like it's like, it will forget what happened or it will not remember important things about the world. So one of the systems we built to help adapt to that to a degree is called World Info. So essentially it's like a memory bank for the AI where you have keywords like king and then textual descriptions. So for example, if you want to define who the king of Larion is, you might have that as a keyword. And then you might have some description about how he's a large, jolly man who like loves pie or, whatever you want to describe. And then whenever he's mentioned, those keywords are mentioned in the story in the last couple sentences, then it will pull that from World Info. So that's, and then it will place it in the prompt that's fed to the story. So essentially you have this limited amount of 2,000 words. And you want to include in those 2,000 words the most important things, right? Like if you're talking to the king, it's like, okay, we want to know who the king is. If you're out in the forest, maybe it doesn't really matter all the king's personality traits because there's more important things for you to remember. So that's one of the pieces that we've built. I feel like there was another piece that you mentioned. What else was there?
Well, before we talk about that, that's really
Sure.
important because what you're describing is context. Like sometimes I'll go and look for my keys and then I'll be like, what was I looking for?
Yeah.
That's a moment where I lost that bit of context, and the AI that runs me lost that. But there's the short-term context, like I'm looking for my keys, and then the longer-term context, I'm trying to save the princess or the prince from wherever.
Yep.
And you're trying to put all of that within limited short-term memory, for lack of a better word, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and to build on that, like we have a lot of other things we're working on for memory. So summarization is one. I think humans, I would say there are a couple main memory systems we use. So like, for example, I don't think either you or me remember every single word that was said in even the last 20 minutes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our brains have summarized that into what's most important for the present so that we can only be thinking about those things as we decide what we should do next. So that's kind of like the summarization piece. And that's a piece we're building for AI Dungeon where it won't remember everything, but it should remember like kind of the rough context of like, hey, where's the story at? Where did we come from, etc.
Mm-hmm.
There's also kind of, I would say, like a memory retrieval type system. So if I say the word fire hydrant, your brain will pull information about a fire hydrant from your memory. It'll be like, oh yeah, like you might see, an image of it in your mind, or the color red, or kind of the function. And so that's another piece that we're working on, figuring out how we introduce in the system. And that's one of the fun things about working in AI Dungeon is like we're trying to build a game where people can play and have fun, but like on the path to it, we're also grappling with a lot of really hard general AI problems, because how do you have memory? How do you have long-term persistence? Like these are all things that like we're still figuring out and researching as we make smarter AI.
Mm-hmm. Security threats in cloud-native environments move fast, which means that security teams need to have the same visibility into their infrastructure, network, and applications as developers and operations. With Datadog security monitoring, engineering teams can easily detect malicious activity in real time before it affects their customers. Use out-of-the-box detection rules and detailed observability data in one unified platform to investigate security attacks. See it in action by signing up for a live security demo and receive a Datadog t-shirt by visiting datadoghq.com/HanselMinutes-security. That's datadoghq.com/HanselMinutes-security. So then the next question that I wanted to understand is now we understand the relationship between the black box, effectively, the model that you talk to, and the context that you wrap around it that abstracts away some of the quirks of it that allow it to be a cohesive game engine and not just a chatbot. It's a dungeon master, effectively. Like the great analogy I'm hearing is that you've got a really clever and smart dungeon master who's managing all your state. How do you see this as a product fitting into the context of engines like Unity? We go to Unity, that's a 3D engine. I go to Unreal, that's a 3D engine. This is now a story engine that I would then plug in. So I can start making games by taking this brain and that pair of arms and those legs, and now I've got a real thing.
Yeah, so there's kind of a simplistic way you could plug that in. So if you take the chatbot analogy, you could imagine like, okay, let's wire this up to an NPC so you can go talk to it in natural language and have, these real conversations. The challenge you end up with is, what if you're talking to a guy and he's like, hey, if you go kill the dragon, I'll give you the sword. But there's no dragon and there's no sword. There's an issue where you can't just have talking mannequins, because I mean, maybe if you have like a town drunk, it's fine because like he's saying crazy things, it's fine. But like to really build the kind of experiences I think people dream of, it takes a lot deeper, a much deeper level of integration into the world, the structure of the world. Like, what is the story? What's going on? Who are the characters? And like that problem's not solved even by us. I think we've done a lot of prototyping and experimentation on how we build these experiences. How do we integrate the AI at a deep level in the story fabric of the world? But it's not solved yet. We've made a lot of progress, but it's exciting but hard problem.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things not being solved yet, like you have the technical, like we just got to write the thing, we just got to do the work. But you've said some things publicly about enabling the next 2 or even 3 orders of magnitudes of large language models because of hardware things. You see things happening in the hardware space. And I don't think people really understand what an order of magnitude is. And then when you say 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, it's almost impossible for anyone to conceive of. Can you help me understand the relationship between hardware improvements that are going to enable those kinds of things versus software improvements?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, the size of these language models has increased by 10x every 6 months, which is so much faster than Moore's law. And what that means is the cost is just increasing dramatically as well. So, like GPT-3 is pretty expensive to run. And this is one thing a lot of people don't realize is AI Dungeon, if you wanted to run it at your house, you would need like an 8 GPU, like deep learning cluster to run it. So in effect, AI Dungeon is in some ways the most computationally expensive game ever like produced, which is kind of fun given that it's a text adventure. It's this interesting kind of like irony. But to get to models, especially above the GPT-3 size, we're gonna need improvements in the hardware and the algorithm smartness to be able to run them in a way that an everyday consumer could have value from. And so there's a lot of cool work on different things that we're seeing coming. So I think one example is Cerebras is a company building this kind of next generation of AI chip where rather than having, one silicon wafer that goes into a bunch of different chips, it's one silicon wafer that in and of itself is one massive like AI compute chip. I think there's a lot of other things going on. So I think we'll actually see some jumps in our hardware computation that will enable a lot of this, but it'll definitely be necessary to be able to get to these next layers of language model intelligence.
Mm-hmm. 30 years ago, when I was like playing things like Doom and Quake, we would have software renderers and we would say, this is the hardest thing that a computer has ever done to like render these walls and render this light. And then you would get a 3D accelerated card. And then suddenly your CPU would go from 100% to 1% because all the work's being done by the GPU. And then things like physics cards were a thing. Like there was a card that's job was physics, not 3D graphics, but physics, not triangles, but physics. And then now fast forward, everyone's got my phone has a 3D accelerated kind of card in it. A lot of, AI logic is matrix math. Is there any chance that we have some of those processors now or could add an AI processor like a NVIDIA 3080, but it's for AI?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. There are advantages to having it on the cloud because, if it's expensive hardware, but it can run all the time, then you can get more value out of it than if it's in someone's house and they're only using it like 10 hours a week or
Mm.
whatever.
Mm.
But I think to do some of these larger issues, we may need to split and have some more of the AI compute on local machines. Some of the things I think of. So I've seen a lot of demos of people plugging in GPT-3 and like text to speech and speech to text to have like a game like experience where you walk around and talk, kind of like we said before. And there's the issue with the story and world, but there's also the issue of if the latency is too high, it just doesn't really feel the way you'd want, right? If you walk up to someone and say like, "How's your day today?" and then you wait for an awkward like 10 seconds before they finally respond, it doesn't feel immersive in the way that people want. And so
Mm.
I think that's one problem that if we can get these chips good enough on local machines, that might solve it.
Yeah, I think your point though of do you need to have that kind of wasteful molecules sitting here distributed, or is there a centralized solution? Like ultimately,
Yeah.
a couple of dozen or even a couple of hundred data centers is very different than millions and millions of people, which speaks to a style of client server effectively software distribution where I've got this iPhone and it's got a quad processor and a GPU and a lot of memory, but there's just things it doesn't do. So I'm going to have it partner with something really, really smart in the cloud. And then the cohesive experience between the smart client and the smart server is where it's at.
Yeah. I'll say especially too for like for some of this natural language stuff, because what you're sharing over the cloud is a tiny, tiny amount of data, right? Like you're sharing 1,000 words. And so like you don't have the same kind of challenges with streaming it that comes with, and I think we've done a lot to figure out video streaming to where it's not as much of an issue, but video streaming is much more data that you're trying to stream in real time than if you're just trying to stream a little bit of text for what a character says next.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that you did just a couple of weeks ago was the generation of visuals.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a really interesting blog post about that. And the model right now does amazing, amazing stuff with locations. Like if you're describing a grassy knoll or a mountain, it's like someone, and these are just created, right? This is literally out of the ether. No one ever saw that mountain before this moment. It was generated.
Yep.
Do you see that going as far as like some of the difficult things in gaming, like texture generation, which is exhausting, takes a team of thousands? Where do you
Yeah.
see visual generation going?
Yeah, I think the AI visuals is going to progress at a pretty fast pace as well. It's a couple years behind natural language, but like we have visual generation methods that are already way better than are currently on AI Dungeon. The issue is there's some cost with some of these better methods where it takes like 10 minutes to generate that we can't quite do in real time. But I think A, those costs will come down. And B, I think there's smart things you can do to kind of pre-generate images and then serve them up to users on the fly. And so we're working on some of those things right now. We just wanted to get up the initial concept of image generation and also just see how users use it, because that will inform a lot as we build the next iterations.
Hmm. And you right now with the image generation and generally you want it to be an inclusive and friendly environment. You're not doing not safe for work
Yeah.
type generation. I am sure, assuming at the same time you don't want the AI dungeon or any large language model to take us in dark or untoward places.
Yeah.
We've seen AI models kind of go off the rails when you point the darkest parts of people at an AI model. You will get really awful stuff. Is that another example of, do you have to just build gates and fences around the model, or can you make a dungeon master that would never go in a weird direction?
Yeah, I think that second one is the ideal. Ideally, we get an AI model that just doesn't do anything of what you don't want. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we are working towards long term. I think in the short term, you do need some other methods. And I think those walls and fences is kind of the analogy I use. One example that I think, in Skyrim, you can't kill kids. And that's just kind of a wall they set up within the game because they're like, hey, we want to make this wall where you're free and safe to explore within those walls, but like you can't go outside of it. And so that's kind of our strategy that we're focusing on in the near term, and in the long term, just working on changing the AI itself. The hard part with AI is, especially with these large language models like GPT-3 that we train on top of. So like we can change our fine tuning data and how we train it, but there's a lot it learned from the internet before we can even like
Mm.
modify it, and we don't have as much control over that. So that makes it a little bit more challenging. And frankly, like to retrain those is like a $10 million thing. So I think we need to get some advancements in how much it costs and time it takes to train so we can iterate faster
Mm.
on improving what those models generate.
Can you help me understand the relationship between AI Dungeon, the instance,
Mm-hmm.
and Latitude, the company? Is AI Dungeon basically the living, breathing proof of concept free game that is a proof that Latitude's engine would be great for your games and your products and people who might be interested?
Yeah, so that's basically along the lines of how I'd say it. I think AI Dungeon is, we often say it's 5% of what we want to build, right? We have a much bigger vision in the long term, but I think it's the proof that the promise is possible. It's the thing that shows like, hey, we could actually make compelling dynamic experiences powered by AI. There's a lot of work to kind of structure it and add these other pieces, but it's possible and it can be fun. And so that's kind of how we see it. It's that first demonstration, and we'll continue to improve it as things come out, like image generation. But we're also working on what does it look like when we have more structured experiences, and how does that experience change?
Hmm. So, how far do you think this has come since like there's blog posts that people can read, and I'm going to go ahead and put links in the show notes. But you do some interesting comparisons where you're like, here's the toy we made at the hackathon that day back in 99,
Yeah,
and then here's where we are now, and then here's a cohesive story that goes on for pages and pages and pages. How do you express to someone that how far this has come in just a couple of years, and where you think it's going in the next few years?
it's pretty amazing, honestly. I think most people don't realize how much AI has advanced in its ability to write compelling text. Because, yeah, as we mentioned, the earliest version of AI Dungeon, it's like you maybe had coherent sentences, but like it wasn't coherent on like the 3 sentence or more level. Whereas now, with the largest language models, it can write paragraphs and paragraphs, and you may not be able to tell that it was not written by a human. Sometimes you can. It's not 100% at that level, but it's pretty surprisingly impressive. So I think where we're at right now is an AI that can write sometimes at a like maybe not quite professional author, sometimes at an amateur author level, and sometimes at like a middle schooler level. So maybe the average is like, high school level or something.
My son's fanfic is what I'm hearing you
Yeah.
say.
Sure, sure. I think it'll advance. I think we'll get up closer to, maybe like a real author level. I think as we try to get up to, a full professional author, there's a lot more we need than bigger language models, because professional authors do more than just, look at the last couple pages and write what comes to them next. They have these complex processes where they're like thinking deeply about what the story arc is going to be and what's the character's journey and like their weaknesses. And they have a lot of like complex ways they approach writing to make a really compelling story. So I think to
Mm.
get to that level, we will need a similar level of intelligence and processing that will take a bit more than a large language model. But I think we'll be pretty compelling even before we get to that point.
That's a really great way to think about it. Like right now, my son is a fanfic author and a walking, talking 15-year-old large language model, right? That's what he is, right? Like, he just knows a lot of words. And he's been writing Zombie World for like 200 pages. No character development has happened, but there's just a lot of zombies. And it just goes on and on. It's just this Google Doc that will not end. So I have a little AI in my house generating this kind of stuff. It'll be interesting to see does he achieve sentience first, or does AI Dungeon get there first?
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm sure he already has more kind of coherence, like ability to detect when things aren't, or things are contradicting themselves than the AI. But and that's one thing. I think one advantage I will say the AI has over humans. Well, it's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that it can think of 100 things and not have any creativity or writer's block, right? Like, it's so good at just throwing things out there, which is its advantage and is one reason why a lot of people use it for writing as like a tool to break through writer's block. But the
Mm.
disadvantage is the same thing. It can write, but it has no filter, no editor in its brain that's like, that's not very good, or like that's incoherent, or that. So I think that's one of the challenges is it has half of kind of what humans do when we write, where we like are able to just kind of generate things, but it doesn't have the part that's can be critical and think through what's good. But that's also the part that sometimes blocks us because we're so obsessed with like, this isn't written quite right that we can't break through that, right?
Yeah. Well, this is a really exciting time, and it's a exciting stuff that you've done. I've been a fan of AI Dungeons since version 1, and my son and I enjoy it very much. I appreciate you chatting with me today.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you as well.
We've been chatting with co-founder and CEO of Latitude, Nick Walton. You can check out AI Dungeon at aidungeon.io and learn more about the company and the engine behind it at latitude.io, and I'll have links to all of that in the show notes. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.